So greetings, and welcome to today's program, part 1 of our 12-part series on managing for quality. This one is Managing Quality-Based Executive Decisions by Dr. Greg Watson. This is Doug Wood with the ASTU Quality Management Division. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Watson.
Thank you, Doug. It's good to be able to talk to you all this evening about this important topic. Most of us, at some point in time, as we grow up in our careers, have to address this issue of how do we get executives to make quality-based decisions. The purpose of this evening is to try to get us to understand a little bit more the dynamics of this and also some of the history about what's been going on. What does it take to make executive decisions? Well, Peter Drucker made a comment in 1967 that I found somewhat humorous. He said, "The computer is a moron, and the stupider the tool, the brighter the master must be. The dumbest tool we've ever had will call its managers to think through their actions." Well, I think this is an interesting thing because now as we start seeing the proliferation of enterprise-wide software systems and the use of computers to guide our decision-making processes, it does make managers think a little bit more about what's really behind the numbers that they see. Where did they come from? And as we move more and more into a digitized world, we'll have to understand exactly what those dynamics mean. So what's the best way for an executive to make a decision? Is it by luck, by chance, by fluke, or is there some other way? Perhaps we should think about the historical approach by using brainstorming or theory opinion. And we see that that doesn't always give us the best idea, but that is actually a major part of making judgments at the executive level. Perhaps we want to go with the new technology-assisted decision aids and start trying to understand how do artificial intelligence and related technologies apply. That also leads us some questions about what can we actually understand from all of those processes. So, did we see a quality 4.0 techno shift coming? Well, in 1997, the ASQ Future Study had an indicator that digital technology could actually restructure the way we're going to work. It says that there's going to be a revolution coming, which was called digital hammers and electronic nails, the tools of the next generation. And this article was suggesting ways that things would evolve and change how we think of things. But it didn't quite get everything right. And what we start seeing today is that digitization is fundamentally changing our world. And it changes the way we're going to cope with how things happen in the workplace, how data is managed, and even the actual job we do in a factory. It's becoming automated. Many different applications of digital technologies are changing exactly the way we do things. There's a technology application that has created warehouses with just a single worker in the control room, and ports operating just with one control to unload ships and put containers on trucks to take them away by automatically guided vehicles. So how will we cope with this as the world becomes smaller and smaller and becomes more and more connected? Well, in 2000, the ASQ Future Study was called Foresight 2020, and it was dedicated to see what would technology drive changes in 2020. Well, now it's 2020, and we want to look back and see what is the role of quality professionals, how has it changed, and in this age of smart systems, how will it change as we look forward? So we're going from Foresight 2020, now we're in 2020, hindsight back, and then foresight forward to understand what else can we be dealing with. But when we do any sort of thinking about the past, we should do what's called historical exegesis. That means trying to understand what was actually happening as we interpret the things that were going on. Matsu Basho, a haiku writer in Japan in the 1600s, said, "Do not seek to follow in the footsteps of the old masters. Seek instead what those masters sought." I interpret this to mean that what we need to do is understand not just the tools and methods that we've had in the past, but try to understand what was the action behind those methods. What was the thing that they were seeking to deal with? What was the application that they were having, or their way of thinking about these things? So as we get into this, we're going to see there'll be 12 lectures coming. And this is just going to be the first of those 12. So the outline for tonight is we'll start by thinking about introducing executive decision making, what it means, and then we'll review some evolution of thinking about this executive decision making process by Chester Barnard, Herbert Simon, Peter Drucker, Daniel Kahneman, Noriaki Kano, and David Teese. And finally, we'll conclude with what is the importance of this EDM for quality professionals. Well, part one. In this introduction, I just want us to think about executive decision-making as a cognitive process. It's a psychological component of how we actually think and act about the way things are going on in response to some of the changes that are happening in our organizations. Exceptional performance in executive decision-making means we can start making sense out of things and understanding the various signals that are coming out of the systems that are around us. Those signals give us some idea about what the future performance is when we project ahead in terms of the probability of what new things could be happening. Thus, developing this idea of EDM and making it work effectively for organizations will require a cross-disciplinary approach. And we're trying to get a strategic choice about what will be the options for an organization in the future. This cross-disciplinary approach is what Dr. Deming was hinted at when he propositioned us with the idea of the system of profound knowledge. And if we apply this system of profound knowledge, we can do investigations that will help to improve executive outcomes. And this will be a theme that we will continue to develop throughout this series of 12 lectures. I have called this, in an article I've written for the Journal of Quality and Participation, the Bayesian Moment. And I got this idea from a comment made by Walter Shewhart in his 1939 book, Statistical Method from the Viewpoint of Quality Control. The comment actually came at the end of the text, and so it's not clear if Shewhart made the comment or it was made by his editor, Dr. Deming. Anyhow, Shewhart said, hindsight supplements foresight. A backward view often adds materially to a forward view. And the way I interpreted this was, hindsight is the realm of history. It's what's happened in the past. This is what happens when we take a look at data analysis from the time series perspective. And we go backwards in time and we look at sample data, or we look at a whole spread of data coming from a process and look at the output of that process. Foresight is the realm of science. This is a realm of prediction, where we're going to make probabilistic understanding or gain probabilistic understanding of what could happen in the future. The idea here is that the Bayesian moment is a point of conversion from hindsight to foresight. And this happens due to what we call insight. Insight is the realm of psychology. This is where we gain understanding and start making sense, observing the situations that are actually happening. So living in the Bayesian moment means we're interpreting history, we're being present, and yet we want to go see the future. So insight is gained by reflective study. This is this current state analysis in the Bayesian moment. It looks at hindsight, the as-is process, and the data that it produced, and it's trying to create a should-be process with a probability of how that will perform. The insight comes when we identify what needs to change. So the Bayesian moment is insight, transforming hindsight into foresight to permit improvement planning for the future. So this is going to be the challenge that we're going to have as we start looking at what things need to happen there. So why is EDM so important? Well, the executive is the person who's actually making the decision about what that future will become. How will resources be dedicated to the future? What are the decision rights that have to spread throughout the organization? And what are the strategic change projects and the strategies that we need to formulate? What are the portfolio of change projects that we need to take on? All of this is occurring in that Bayesian moment. We're making alternative choices about the actions we will take to drive for a future. Shewhart laid the foundation for this in a mental model that we've come to know as the Shewhart cycle. And we see that the Shewhart cycle is operating in this Bayesian moment. It creates a specification, and then it tests that specification, and then it makes some conclusions about this and adjusts the specification. So Deming called this process also, in his book, The New Economics, the concept of the system of profound knowledge, in which he said we have to have a learning organization, and that the organizations need to learn if executives are going to transform those organizations. This is done through executive decision-making. So executive decision-making is really supporting the strategic management of processes by the executives of the organization. And the theory of profound knowledge operates in the Bayesian moment to evaluate alternative choices using scientific methods. So, where has this thinking process come from? Who were the contributors to this? Well, the very first was Chester Barnard. Chester Barnard wrote a book called The Functions of the Executive in 1938. And his book also included an essay called Mind in Everyday Affairs, and there was a collection of his papers that were published in 1948. And he made this comment. He said, the fine art of executive decision consists in not deciding questions that are not now pertinent, in not deciding prematurely, in not making decisions that can be made effective, and in not making decisions that others could make. It seems like he's trying to avoid all the decision-making processes. But actually, he's really identifying that the executive needs to focus on exactly those things. Not all decisions of the organizations must be made at the top. And Barnard looked at this whole idea of management and decision-making process as an art. He made this comment, it's a rare old dog that can learn new tricks, and the art of management and dealing with affairs is no exception. He says, we play it by ear. Management's an art. It'll always be one, can never be completely understood. Even the greatest artists, with very rare exceptions, will be unable to understand what they are doing in a scientific sense. Well, this is interesting, because if the executives can't really understand exactly what they do, we tend to consider this executive judgment. And this is going to be one of the themes we start seeing, that intuition is driving things. Executives do not enjoy the luxury of making their decisions on the basis of orderly, rational analysis, but depend largely on intuitive, judgmental responses to decision-making. And what he did was, Barnard separated the idea of logical and non-logical processes. So logical processes are the reasoning processes we see. Typically, we reflect those in words and symbols or mathematics. Non-logical processes are those that are capable of being expressed in words, but are made using a judgment or a decision or an action. But it's not because of the logical construct of the decision itself. And Barnard identified that there is something called a zone of indifference. We see this cartoon here. We have an agreement in principle. The question is, do we all have the same principles? A zone of indifference is where the organization and everybody's own set of personal values and personal modes of thinking and ways of being, the cultures we exist in, that all of those then are in alignment with the organization. So when an order is issued, it doesn't conflict with what individuals want. It's exactly the same in terms of each person, that they feel no way to fight that, but it doesn't actually affect them. They don't necessarily have to buy in strongly, but they don't have any objections based on their internal makeup. The next person who came along to talk was Herbert Simon. And Herbert Simon was a very interesting man. He was a Nobel laureate in economics. His book, Administrative Behavior, was the one that started us thinking about the idea of psychological approaches towards management decision-making. He also was the individual who came up with the term artificial intelligence. In his book, Administrative Behavior, Simon discussed something called bounded rationality. And he said all decisions are constrained by three limits. The first limit is the integrity of the information that's used to support the decision. Is the information solid? Does the information actually describe what's happening? The second is the competence of the decision maker. Does the decision maker have the ability to read and interpret the data? Do they understand the technology and the context in which the decision is being made? And third is the degree of urgency under which the decision is being made. And Simon made the observation that if you have a strong sense of urgency, you don't have time to go back and get sound data. You don't have time to inform the decision maker about competence, but you have to use the organizational resources in a different way. Simon also went on, and he made the comment is that artificial intelligence can be an aid to intuition. So Simon said, understood that intuition is a form of pattern recognition, and that if we can create some form of rules or mental constructs based on what we observe of history or formal experiences. So this is saying information creates a heuristic rule-based structure that observes repetitions in events or observes patterns that we notice which fit some familiar pattern. That sounds an awful lot like what we see in control charts. Because in control charts, what are we doing? We're taking a look at the history of the data, the observations. We're looking at, do they fit some familiar patterns, like the AT&T tests? And then where do those patterns actually inform us about what's going on in those former experiences in terms of the process behavior that that's describing? So we see that this idea that he has about decisions also came into a fact that he then started dividing decisions into three sections. He said there's a hierarchy of decisions, a complex network of decision processes, and each decision involves both a goal and a relevant behavior. But he said the decisions really have three different premises. So the first, he said, was intelligence activity. Here we're talking about problem solving or recognition. What is happening? He says there can be structured problem solving, structured ad hoc problem solving, or structured continuous search. So this is the front end. We call this the recognize or define stages in a Six Sigma investigation. The design activity is where we're trying to develop the alternative solutions. And those alternative solutions then have to be founded based on some sort of evidence-based system. And from that, we can then have a choice activity where we analyze the alternatives and determine which one is best given the circumstances and the options that we have presented to us. Drucker came along after this, and he was influenced by both Barnard and Simon. And as we start seeing Drucker, we see he has said an awful lot about what's going on in the system. So Drucker has written many books, over 30 of them. I interviewed him when I was the president of ASQ for the speech at the Annual Quality Congress, or WCQI now. And he made some comments that were quite interesting about this job of the executive. And he said, the important and difficult job is never to find the right answers. It's always to find the right questions. For very few things are as useless, if not dangerous, as a right answer to the wrong question. Drucker emphasized questions many, many times in his writings. At another point in time, he was talking about the major questions that we have to have when we're looking into a problem. And he made some other observations. So Drucker said, effective executives do not make many decisions. They only concentrate on what's important. They try to make a few decisions on the highest level of conceptual understanding to set out the principles. They try to find the constants. What is going to be the thing that works across the organization? They don't work on solving specific problems. They leave that to the organization. They're not impressed by the speed of decision making. They consider virtuosity in manipulating a great many variables a symptom of sloppy understanding, sloppy thinking. They want to know what is a decision about and how do we get to the point? What is the underlying reality that has to be satisfied? And they want impact rather than the technique. So the simplest things are more effective for them. They would want to have a sound decision rather than a clever approach. Drucker also said that effective executives know when a decision must be based on principle and when it should be based pragmatically on the merit of the case. They also see what is the trickiest decision, what is the wrong compromise. And they've learned to tell one of those from the other. They know what the most time-consuming step is not about making a decision, but implementation, getting it put into effect. And if a decision is degenerated into work, it's not a decision. It's at best a good intention. And Dr. Deming talked about making decisions based on good intentions many times. Make decisions by the right people in the right way at the right time. effective decisions from a systematic process with clearly defined elements that is handled in a distinct sequence of steps. And this is quite aligned with what we've been doing in quality, going all the way back to the very beginnings of the Japanese approaches with their plan do, check, act cycle in the early 1950s. We next see along comes Daniel Kahneman. And Daniel Kahneman is also a Nobel laureate, just as Herbert Simon was. And Kahneman talks about this idea of thinking fast and slow in his 2011 book. And while we saw that Barnard was talking about both the thinking modes of rationality and this heuristic approach of subjectivity, and Simon was focusing on then rational decision-making influenced by emotion, Kahneman blended this all into a system, and he identified two modes of operation. He called one System 1, intuitive, emotionally based, subjective decisions. These are decisions that are made based on feelings. He then said System 2 is logical, analytical, rationally based decisions. These were objective decisions, and this is based on some set of reasoning process and reflection. And what he observed was that 70% of all executive decisions are made using System 1. And this is kind of interesting because as we look at this, what we see is that the System 1 decisions are not really supported by the things that we as a quality community tend to emphasize. That's the data-driven emphasis on evidence-based management by fact. And so what he suggested was that executive decisions are best made if System 2 rules inform System 1 executive decisions. In other words, there's a small set of rules to guide the executives as they bring to bear their judgment. The next person that we think of here is Dr. Noriaki Kano. And Dr. Kano brought in another dimension into this process. In his theory of attractive quality in 1984, Kano wrote about this, and he said that quality activity can only begin if top management is conscious of the need for organization-wide commitment and its own responsibility for introducing such activity. And notice he doesn't say for performing that activity, but for introducing it. This is very similar to what Henri Fayol said in his General and Industrial Statistics in 1916, where he said the executive in charge must have the permanent effect to introduce a quality or continual improvement into all aspects of the organization. But Kano also noted that improving all attributes of quality will not lead to satisfied customers, as not all attributes are equal in their eyes. And this then illustrates what we were just talking about in terms of Simon's concept and Drucker's concepts, where we start seeing that there has to be some way of dealing with this idea of how do we create this possibility for people to understand things in a different way. And so Kano created his model, and I'm sure most of you have seen this model before. I'm going to present it in a slightly different way. In Japanese, there are two different words that modify the word Hinshitsu, which is quality. Miryokuteki Hinshitsu is meaning attractive quality, is how Kano deciphered it, but it's usually meant the charm of quality, that special thing that attracts you. And this was something that Kano noted. It's an unspoken quality characteristic. People can't see it. It's a latent characteristic. It's hidden in the fabric of something. This is when you get that special idea that this is a hot idea or a hot product or a hot service. The second word is arame Hinshitsu. This is talking about the must-be quality, but it's actually more properly translated as fitness for use or fitness for purpose, which was what Duran called quality. And here we're talking about basically a commodity quality. This is saying these are the fundamental things that this product or service has to deliver. These also are unspoken characteristics. So Kano then used those two Japanese words to create like bookends in terms of the function. And the middle line, which I'm calling competitive quality, he identified as spoken quality. And this is what he called one-dimensional quality. This is where people make choices in how they're going to deal with a particular item. choosing one alternative over another based on the quality characteristics that are embedded in that particular capability. So Kano's idea here is actually saying there's three different levels, and we see that over time, quality is actually changing from differentiated to competitive to commodity quality. And Kano called this the effect of gravity, or motion that's moving through the process. The final person that we're going to talk about here is David J. Teese. Dr. Teese has not won his Nobel Prize yet. I suspect that may happen in the future. But he is a professor at UC Berkeley who's talked about dynamic capabilities. And this is a little different than what we typically talk about in terms of process capability, but it's talking about the capability of the organization. And he described this as a relationship between innovation with competition in new development and how technology is using to advance the firm's ability to integrate, build, and reconfigure its own competence to address a rapidly changing environment. And that's precisely what the executive function needs to do, according to our colleagues that we've looked at before, such as Drucker. And we see that this dynamic capability is actually built on the concept of some sort of executive oversight. So dynamic capabilities are threefold. There's a capacity to sense and shape the opportunities and threats that face an organization. So that's this strategic positioning of the organization relative to emerging technologies or to emerging competitive positions in the marketplace. It's an ability to seize opportunities and make decisions that will implement needed change for our organization. And this is what we see in terms of the need for the executive to take action and to get that big picture about what must be done and how do we change things. And it's also stamina to maintain competitiveness through continual enhancing, combining, protecting, and reconfiguring the business in terms of its assets, the tangible and intangible. So developing this is at the core of an organization's ability to succeed in success. So what's the requirement for that? The requirement is actually astute executives. Can they learn how to exercise leadership through quality? Can they understand what is necessary to create the future that will give them that new state of condition based on the historical understanding of the past? So this is really the objective in terms of where we are going with what needs to happen in that Bayesian moment. So, what does this actually mean for us as quality professionals? Well, I want to tell a little story. When I was interviewing Peter Drucker in 2001, before he gave his speech on Drucker on quality, and that was also a cover story in Quality Progress, I got to spend 3 days with him. And it was quite interesting. I'd gone through all of his books and tried to understand all of the different things that he had said about quality. And in this process, I was asking him about how are we coping? Now, we're just coming out of the 2000 future study of ASQ, that Foresight 2020 that I mentioned at the very beginning. And I wanted to get Peter's understanding of what that future would be in terms of roles of the people in the process. Would the quality role be shifting significantly with technology? And how would the quality organization, especially the quality professionals who are leading that organization, how would they interact with their executives? And so we saw this evolving role becoming mentors or coaches in the organizational leaders. And in that capacity, we wanted to understand how would we work to guide and support this decision-making process of executives. So I asked Peter, how can we convince CEOs to do quality? And this was at the point in time, and we were closing out the lecture, and his answer was intriguing, and I actually found it a little humorous. He first started by clearing his voice, and he said, and then his words were, "It's not your job to train your CEOs. They are bright people and can understand quickly what needs to be accomplished. However, it is the job of the staff to clearly report necessary information that CEOs can easily assemble and understand so they may draw their own conclusions." And that's the role we have in the future. How do we become a trusted advisor, And that means that we're going to make sure measurement systems work, make sure that rule-based thinking is applied, and that the rules can inform the executives about the range of choices they have to make, and even the preferred alternatives. And some of these decisions may be made using technology supports. Some of them may be using team-based decision processes. And so the challenge we're going to have is, how will we actually blend together the intuition of the executives and their judgment with the fact-based systems that create the boundary conditions that, if you will, constrain their judgments based on facts that are unassailable. So this is the challenge we're going to have in our process. How do we actually do this in the long term? Now, we have a lot of time available for us this evening. This is my first one of doing these. I'm not exactly quite sure how much time to use in terms of PowerPoint and talking with these things. And what I really would like to do is have a robust conversation about this with all of you. So I'm hoping that we've had some questions coming in from the audience, and that we can talk about those as we spend the rest of this time together. So I don't know if any questions have been coming in. Doug, can you tell me if they are?
Yeah, Greg, we have not we've not seen a lot of questions yet. I suspect that perhaps they were absorbing the immense amount of content you've been providing us. Thank you.
Okay.
We'll give them a chance to kind of come back with some questions here a little bit.
Okay.
I find your that last remark by Peter Drucker to be really interesting. He seemed a little peeved?
No, actually he wasn't peeved. He was impish. He was being very humorous about it. I do see there is one question. Why do I call it the Bayesian moment? And the reason I call that is because of Reverend Thomas Bayes created what became known as Bayes' theorem after he had passed away, actually. And Bayes' theorem is a theorem of conditional probability, that the probability of future event is the probability of, given its preceding event. So the probability of A is the probability of A given B. And so the B, if you will, is the history. The probability of A is the future. And so in the Bayesian moment, it's a transformation from the history to the future. And that's why I called it the Bayesian moment. Okay, another question came up. Is EDM only for top management? Well, that's an interesting question. What is top management? I like to think of organizations in terms of 3 levels. And level 1 is about what's happening in the workplace. We call that Gemba, okay? And if you take a look and call that Gemba 1, that's the workplace where we have process-intensive work. The Gemba above that, Gemba 2, is an administrative Gemba where we have the flow of business. And Gemba 3 is the executive level of the organization where we're making the strategic decisions. And if you remember, Teiji Ono talked about in workplace management that each of those Gemba can have 3 different types of wastes. And one of those wastes is called Mori. So Mori is actually meaning, directly translated from Japanese, thou shalt not have waste from cognitive processes. And so the question then is, what can they do? Well, Gemba 1, we can have waste from cognitive processes. We make the wrong decisions about how to set up our daily work or how to do inspection. And so we can use decision-making tools to deal with that. But that's not necessarily EDM. Those decisions tend to be made based on sound statistical or process knowledge that we've gained from the process. If we go up to the level above this, we see that we have flow decisions, and here what we're looking mostly is the flow across the organization. And those decisions can be made based on statistical and process-based thinking. This is still now more rule-based types of thinking. As we go above that to the executive thinking, we move into a different type of mental model. That mental model is, or that explanation of the nature of things, tends to be much more abstract. And in that abstract level, we need to think about things in a very different way. And that's why I'm focusing on the executive decision making. We are well prepared as quality professionals to work on the first two levels. We're well prepared to work and have done considerably long and outstanding work on the first level of the work process. We also can work across the processes because we use basically the same set of tools. But as we move into the executive level, things change. And so this is the question about what sort of tools we should have. Well, they're going to change, and digitization will change them. We have basically a need for some sort of detection tools. Can that detection come from the way we built our process, the way we created measurement control points? Maybe those control points are digitized and we have digital sensors in there. So we're going to start seeing a lot of those changes happening. We also will see that there are going to be sense-making tools. How do we create some sort of understanding about what's happening in the process? And we have to understand the process and be able to get some sort of documentation of that process before we can really simplify it, because otherwise we might be simplifying the wrong thing. We should also be sure that we get the waste out of the process before we put the variation control, because we don't want to control variation of a wasteful process. So those are things that should be happening in that process. I see there's another question. Are there any decision-making tools? Actually, we shouldn't worry about the tools because it's really a decision-making process. People who focus on tools for executives miss the guidance that we were getting from Drucker and others that I went through, where they say they need the big picture, they need the patterns, they don't want the small ideas, they don't want clever tools. There's an article in Harvard Business Review by David Garvin where he talks about how do you deal with executive tools. And he basically came out and said, it's not the tools that make a difference. Often the simplest tools are all the executives need. What they really need to have is sound data. I had one executive tell me that when he got into his organization, the 7 billion euro company, he said, you know, I'm just guessing because I don't get any idea of sound data. So data with integrity is a big important thing. Getting either their own competence or the competence from their organizational network, and then understanding how do they get ahead of the decision curves of the organization. I've been involved in two very fast-running companies, at Compaq Computer when it was doubling and Nokia mobile phones when it was growing at 86% a year. And if you want to make executive decisions, you have to be faster than the company is changing, because you have to make decisions about changes that will be happening in 18 months when you're doubling the size of the company or changing that fast. Another question here came up is should the QA manager mostly advise the CEO? Well, no. There's a number of people that need to be advised, if you will, by a QA manager. And so we have to see that there's a number of audiences we have to deal with. And as the organization becomes more mature and we extend our capability to be able to communicate in that organization, and we gain the trust of that organization, we earn the right to talk to the executive. And we have to be sure that we talk in their language. This is one of the most important things, because if we're talking in their language, they can understand us. If we talk in the language of Gemba 1, they say that's not my work. Many executives say, I don't want to work on a quality strategy because they've been presented with quality strategies about ISO 9000 or buying some process controllers or something like this. And that's not what they are looking for in their questions. When we see what these people have been talking about that I've mentioned already, they say they want the big picture. They want to focus not on each of the little decisions that can be made in the organization. What are the big changes that will create the direction, the future of this organization? So I think those are some of the questions that I've seen coming up here. Are there some more?
Yeah, Greg, I've got a couple have come into the chat box here. So one of the questions they brought up here was, in many cases you get what you pay for. and this seems to be inherently true of quality. Executives seem willing more often than not to accept the risk associated with choosing manufacturers, knowing their quality might be inferior to other more expensive companies because of the upfront cost savings. Usually, they end up spending more time fixing the issues and then paying for it in the long run. Is there a more effective way to approach this conversation with executives? What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts?
Well, it's a really good question. I mean, what I do with executives is I don't talk to them about cost of manufacturing because, again, they delegate that into the organization. What they are held personally responsible for, though, is the profitability of the organization. And so if they say, you know, I don't want to worry about that purchasing stuff, that belongs down to the organ, that's a manufacturing decision. That's one of the things they depress, and that's why they get into a lot of troubles. They might come up with a policy like, let's buy from low-cost countries without understanding the ramifications of it. Or they will make decisions based just on purchase price and not including things like warranty costs, sunk engineering costs, problems dealing with long supply chains and obsolescence and all those other costs. So one thing that has to happen is we have to get in place a set of sound decision rules that consider the holistic problem when it comes to those things about purchasing. From the executive viewpoint, though, the question that they need to deal with is what they deliver to their customer, which are the shareholders and stock analysts, if you're in a public company outside, or if it's a public organization, to the government that they're serving. And those questions deal with the ability of the organization to effectively use their resources. We tend to get stuck in the operational flow of the business, and executives are stuck in the resource flow. They get money in from various sources, and they have to use it efficiently, and they have to be able to provide some sort of return. I've never met an executive when I've talked to them and they say, I don't care about quality. I said, does it mean you don't care about the quality of your revenue, the quality of your cash flow, the quality of your profit, the ability to sustain long-term success? Oh yeah, that's what I do. That's my job. And so we start thinking about that. We have to elevate our decisions into that arena and start thinking, what will it take to convince them using their logic? Now, every organization has a different profit model. So for some, it's return on assets. For some, it's return on capital employed. Some, it's return on sales. Some of it's gross profit. Some people use EBITDA. All of those different languages basically reflect different operating models of the organization from a financial viewpoint. So we have to understand those, and then what are the decisions that drive that from the operational side that will create changes in that profitable structure. At the bottom line, the executive wants profitable growth. That's what they're paid for. And so how do we get that for them and then focus that for them is really, I think, a big question in terms of where we can act as an advisor.
Okay. So one of the questions, this takes us back a bit, and I think you've sort of answered this, but if an executive does not provide the proper tools to get them data, they want data, you said, but what if the organization lacks tools to sift, sort the data, and provide you know, a clean consensus of data with integrity? How can you communicate the importance of that? How would you phrase it?
Well, in my consulting practice, I basically don't worry about data integrity. I go in and I grab some data. The data I always grab, because it's there in every process, is productivity data or cycle time. And what I do typically is I do a little torture of the data. I show the time history of it. I take a look at the capability. I see what's the probability plot. I look at that productivity across processes using ANOVA. And in a very short period of time, you can give a picture of the organization's lack of efficiency or lack of effectiveness based on just very little data. And at that point in time, you can say, this is what we can do with just your productivity data. However, we can't get to the causes behind this loss of productivity. We have to have the data management system there. I think this is, in the digital age, perhaps the most important job of a quality manager, and that is to make sure that we get good data and sound data in the system. Many organizations have either SAP or Oracle data systems, and most of those are set up just to be number counters. But not everything that counts really can be counted, and not everything that you count actually does count. And so we have to see, how do we create a master data set that actually will give us the information that feeds into the performance measurement system, that informs the executives we have a problem, and can also connect down to the work level. So one of the things that people have, I think, been misled about is this idea of a balanced scorecard. The guy who created the concept of the balanced scorecard, or who published it first, actually published it in Quality Progress in 1988. His name was Art Schneiderman, and he was from Analog Devices. Kaplan and Nolan found out about it from him, and then they totally changed it around. Schneiderman found out about it from Yokogawa Hewlett-Packard from their business fundamental measures. And there were 12 measures in that organization. Those measures did not have balance. They did have some operational connectivity, and they drove the financial performance. And because you could predict financial performance from the operational measures, that's what gave the strength of that system. The Yokogawa Hewlett-Packard system was actually built by the CEO and the head of quality there, and it was the one key ingredient that took them from the least profitable division of Hewlett-Packard in 1976 to the most profitable 5 years later in 1981 when they won the Deming Prize. And so what we see is that it's not just about the tools and methods that they use, it's about how we think about them and how we can get even simple measures to inform the executives. There's something rotten in I don't want to say in Denmark because I'm living in Finland, but there's something rotten in the system, and we need to fix the measurement system first so we can understand it. Something else?
Yeah, this is Doug again. I want to mention the fact that ASQ does have a course that is designed to help you build a series of metrics around your organization's strategic directions, and also to align measures up and down the decision tree so that they don't fight one another. So it's an unusual class. It's not really about quality. Okay, so a couple more things. So earlier you mentioned the CEO should be provided data. Is there any specific data you're hinting at? I mean, I think you answered that a little bit. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, Drucker had some comments about this. In an article I wrote for the Six Sigma Forum in 2002, it was called Selling Six Sigma to CEOs, not my title, but one that was chosen for me. I mentioned the Drucker report. And in the Drucker report, we start with operational performance measures, usually based on quality, cost, time, safety, and so forth. And then they consolidate into measures like operational types of measures, like deliver to promise. And this is taking a look at how is our system actually delivering to customer promise. We take a look at productive processes as how the process is flowing. We can take a look at the waste systems and as to how they accumulate across the process. And we can take a look at the motivation of workers, because demotivated workers actually don't perform as well in a system. And we can also take a look at safety, because if you have safety issues, that those are also problems that create losses in the system. The Japanese have what they call 6 losses in the system, and those losses actually can all be affected or understood by the basic performance measurements, and then bringing them up into a higher level performance measure, not an index, but an indicator of how these actually combine to create something like rolled throughput yield for the organization or productivity for the organization. And I think those simple constructs are all you need. If you go one level above that, you would be consolidating into the financial measurement system. It's not a predictive system anymore at that point in time. So I think one of the things that has not been captured well when people talk about y is a function of x, for instance, is that y is a function of x does not end up at the executive level. It ends up at the business level below the executive, but that the executive themselves has to get the information that they would be reporting to their customers. So they would be getting the trends of the Ys and then how they consolidate the financials. Did that satisfy?
I think so.
Okay.
So we did have another question here. Back to your Bayesian moment. Let me find that question again. Okay, the question was, are there any specific principles that you have in mind in order to use the insight with the hindsight to create the foresight?
Yes, actually, I think this is not well developed. It will be across the whole series of these lectures. If we go into the insight component, we've actually done a very poor job of psychology. We've gotten off on a lot of different tracks and so forth. But I think some of the world of social psychology can inform us quite nicely on this. They talk about two things. One is situational awareness. And that is, are we becoming alerted or noticing or observing the things that are changes that will impact the organization? So first we have to observe them. If we don't observe them, we don't do anything. So getting ourselves situationally aware to those things happening in our environment or internally that will create or stimulate change. The second thing that is there, that they go through a process called sense making. And we tend to reduce that to problem solving. But sense making is actually a much broader application. It's a little bit more specific to the scientific method than what we do in problem solving. And it's got more of the ingredients of the psychological understanding in the process and how the different components of a productive system work. So we tend to think about the productive system as the ingredients around the hardware, the software, and so forth, those components. But what's emerging in the sense-making out of social psychology is also the sense of the human understanding of value systems, how people react in different ways, how people work in terms of their understanding of how the work is actually aligned to their own particular moral code. In Japan, this is called Jisu Kanri. It's self-regulated management systems, where you understand how you yourself fit into the management system. So Kanri just means management system. Jisu is a self-control management system. And this is one of the ingredients that Toyota has come up with. They started it in late 1996 with operator Jisu Kanri. They've moved into supervisor Jisu Kanri, and now they're applying it in the executive levels. I think the first writing on this came out actually in a newsletter that is just published by the ASQ Lean Enterprises division, where I wrote a paper with Shinichi Sakachi, who's the Toyota board responsible for quality. And he was the gentleman who, when he was the quality manager of the Nagoya factory, who came up with Jisu Kanri and another thing called JKK, which is the process of getting people to take ownership for their work. And I think those are our critical ingredients on the psychology side that need to be considered.
Okay, very good then. So we've had a lot of questions here. Again, I want to thank you, Dr. Watson, for what we've seen here. I think we've got a couple more closing items to handle shortly.
Okay.